Chester Cathedral, the setting for this year's Royal Maundy service, one of the highlights of the royal calendar. This is the day on which, by tradition, the sovereign distributes alms to the poor. The purses used in the service are red and white, like the Tudor originals. The red ones contain £5.50 in cash, while the white ones contain the specially minted Maundy coins. The Royal Maundy service is one of the rare occasions on which the Queen actually handles money, and one of the few times when royalty is seen giving money away. The subject of money has developed into one of the most contentious issues surrounding the British monarchy today. A recent opinion poll carried out by Mori showed that 3/4 of the population think that the royal family should not receive as much money as it does. And almost half went further still, saying that the royal family is an expensive luxury the country cannot afford. So just what is the true cost of the British monarchy, and how harmful are arguments about money likely to be for the House of Windsor? To fulfil her duties as head of state, the Queen receives a payment from the government every January, known as the Civil List. This is to cover the cost of staff salaries and other expenses involved in running the royal household. The Civil List was traditionally fixed at the beginning of a monarch's reign and had to last for the duration. Until 20 years ago, it had never exceeded £500,000. But in 1969, the Duke of Edinburgh complained on an American television programme that the monarchy was in financial trouble.
We had a small yacht which we had to sell, and I shall probably have to give up polo fairly soon, things like that. Inevitably, if nothing happens, we shall either have to, I don't know, we may have to move into smaller premises, who knows?
So in 1970, the Conservative Party doubled the Civil List to just over £1 million a year. Then, in 1975, to keep up with inflation, the Wilson government index-linked the Civil List to go up every year in line with prices. But the palace never liked this arrangement, as it led to critical headlines every spring when the increase was announced. So in 1990, almost unnoticed, Mrs. Thatcher agreed a new deal. The Queen's Civil List would jump from £5 million to nearly £8 million a year, and this would be fixed for the next 10 years.
It was a tremendous palace coup. It was exactly what they wanted. I mean, the Queen and her courtiers have been lobbying Downing Street for several years for this, because they were sick of this continual criticism which the Crown faced every spring.
Payments to the 7 other members of the royal family on the Civil List were also increased, bringing the total to just under £10 million. But despite the widespread belief that this is all the monarchy costs the nation, the true picture shows that the full cost is actually many times that amount.
The Civil List used to pay for nearly all the costs of the monarchy, but over this century, particularly since the war, a lot of charges have been transferred from the Civil List and are now met by government departments. This has been done very, very quietly indeed.
An early example of this process came in 1953, when the Ministry of Defence took on the running of the Royal Yacht Britannia, together with the Queen's flight. Britannia has a crew of 270 and is the second largest yacht in the world. It costs over £9 million a year to run.
When Britannia was built, Parliament was told that the justification for the cost was that it could be used as a hospital ship in time of war. In fact, Britannia has never gone to war. In the Falklands War in 1982, we were told it couldn't go to the South Atlantic because it used the wrong type of fuel. This was quite untrue, because HMS Hermes, the flagship, used identically the same sort of fuel and fought there with no difficulty at all.
The Queen's flight was recently upgraded at a cost of £40 million. It now consists of 3 BAE 146 jets and 2 Westland helicopters. They have their own special air traffic control lanes, known as Purple Airways, to keep them well away from other traffic. The cost to the taxpayer, £6.7 million a year. Then there's the royal train. Not a train as such, but 12 different carriages that can be used in any combination. The Department of Transport took over its running costs in 1960. Today they amount to around £2.3 million a year. Other costs which have been transferred from the civil list to various government departments include royal visits abroad and state visits to this country. But the upkeep of the palaces and other royal residences is the biggest bill of all. They cost the Department of the Environment £25.5 million a year.
The monarchy's been, I think, fairly clever in passing these costs over to government departments. The public, the media, tend to concentrate on the civil list, which costs only about £10 million a year. Much less is heard of all these other expenses met by government departments, which come to at least £46 million a year. The result is that people think the monarchy doesn't cost that much.
But £56 million still doesn't cover the total running cost of the British monarchy. The royal family derive additional income from the duchies of Lancaster and Cornwall. The Duchy of Lancaster consists of valuable land in central London, including the site of the Savoy Hotel, and 52,000 acres of farmland in the Midlands and the North. The Queen earns £3 million a year from these lands. This money is known as her privy purse, and it goes towards personal expenses, such as the upkeep of her private homes at Sandringham and Balmoral, her clothes, and her charity subscriptions. By tradition, the revenues from the Duchy of Cornwall go to the heir to the throne, and last year they topped £3 million for the first time. The high level of public concern about the cost of the monarchy is fueled by the fact that the Queen is already believed to be the richest person in the country. Both Forbes and Fortune magazine, usually recognised as reliable authorities on the very wealthy, rank her fifth in the world and estimate her fortune at between £5 and £7 billion. But such estimates are almost certainly too high.
You have to realise when talking about the Queen's wealth that there's a difference between her wealth as head of state and her private fortune. All these estimates that range from £5 billion to £7 billion are concerned with her role as head of state. They include art treasures, the Crown estates, royal stamp collections, all the furniture, Buckingham Palace, everything's rolled into those figures. And it's not really fair to say that those are hers to sell and dispose of.
But although these national treasures can't be considered to be part of the Queen's personal wealth, she does have extensive assets of her own. Her estate at Sandringham in Norfolk is her personal property and is valued at around £75 million. Balmoral Castle and grounds would probably fetch another £40 million. She also has stables at West Ilsey in Berkshire and racehorses worth several million. And her personal jewellery collection has been valued at around £40 million. But it's extremely hard to ascertain the full extent of the Queen's personal fortune because of the secrecy surrounding it. Historian James RUSBRIDGER, for example, has tried to find out how much the Queen inherited from her father, King George VI.
Everyone's will is public property, and copies of all wills come here to Somerset House, where they can be inspected by anyone. The only exceptions are wills of the royal family. Until the death of Queen Victoria, royal wills were available for inspection. Now, the public cannot see them. They're locked away upstairs in a safe, and no one is allowed to see them at all. And so, the royal fortune remains a secret.
And it's the same story with the Queen's investments.
If you want to know the details of people's shareholdings in British companies, you come here to Companies House in London, where they're all available for public inspection. But with one exception, the Queen's. When the Companies Act of 1976 was passed, a special clause was inserted, which gave the Queen the right not to disclose her shareholdings for public viewing. And thus we see another example of how the secrecy surrounding the Queen's wealth prevents the public from knowing about it.
In 1971, a House of Commons Select Committee was set up specifically to examine the royal finances. But even they couldn't get to the bottom of the matter.
Although it was a very high-powered, powerful committee with the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the chair and Harold Wilson, an ex-Prime Minister, one of the members of it, and Privy Councillors, all kinds of high-powered people, the monarchy virtually thumbed its nose at it and said, "To hell with you, we're not telling you anything."
The most the Queen would say, through her spokesman Lord Cobbold, was that estimates which at that time put her wealth at between 50 and 100 million pounds were grossly exaggerated. Using this statement as a starting point, it's possible to estimate the Queen's worth today.
Let's assume she had £30 million 20 years ago. If you look at the way the stock markets have performed in the last 25 years, you'll be talking about a figure at least £500 million for an equity portfolio today. Add in her personal estates, her personal art treasures, her jewellery, her racehorses, you're talking about a figure probably around £1 billion.
On this estimate, the Queen is by no means the richest person in the country. She actually ranks 16th on the list. Nevertheless, hers is a huge fortune, and it's been built up surprisingly recently. When Queen Victoria came to the throne, she inherited a massive debt of £50,000, equivalent in today's prices to £2.5 million.
In the early years of Queen Victoria's reign, the monarchy was looked down on by many of the richest members of the aristocracy because, by comparison, it was actually very poor. There were inherited debts from the Hanoverians, and when Victoria married Albert, she simply married a poor and rather obscure German princeling. So the monarchy in the 1830s, 40s and 50s was hard up. And in the light of that undeniable fact, the exponential growth of the royal fortune over the last 100 years is not just remarkable, it's quite unprecedented.
It was Prince Albert who laid the foundations of the royal fortune. He pursued household economies with relentless efficiency. At Windsor, for example, he allowed no visitor, however august and however spacious his bedroom, to have more than 2 candles to light his chamber. His economies paid off. Income from the duchies of Lancaster and Cornwall increased considerably. In 1852, the royal couple were able to buy Balmoral with the savings they had made. The purchase of Sandringham followed soon after. But it was after Albert's death that the growth of the royal fortune really took off.
During the 1860s and 1870s, after Albert had died, Victoria stopped appearing in public, stopped doing the kind of public ceremonial functions associated with the monarchy. She was paid a considerable civil list, in part to finance those public appearances, which she was now no longer making. And it was widely believed that as a result of that, she saved the money and put it towards her own private fortune, thereby making, in fact, a personal wealth out of public funds.
But the single most important factor in the creation of a great royal fortune has been the monarch's gradual exemption from all forms of tax.
The Queen doesn't pay any tax at all. This really is the key to the whole fortune, her tax position. She pays no income tax, no capital gains tax, no death duties, no inheritance taxes of one sort or another. And that means that her equity portfolio, say worth £500 million at a conservative estimate today, will grow at £50 million a year without too much trouble.
This tax-free status is relatively recent. Both Queen Victoria and her son, Edward VII, paid their tax like everyone else. But when George V came to the throne in 1910, income tax on the civil list was ended. Then, in the 1930s, the King made a secret deal with the Chancellor to stop paying tax on his Duchy of Lancaster revenue. And George VI made another secret arrangement in the 1950s to relieve him from paying taxes on his private income. So in 40 years, the sovereign went from paying all taxes to paying none. This story of royal tax exemption has only recently been uncovered by historian Philip Hall.
I was very shocked to learn that monarchs lobbied very, very hard to get out of paying tax, that in fact they used to pay tax in the last century and in the beginning of this century. And if you look at the correspondence between Buckingham Palace and government and the Treasury, it shows that they really were pleading all the time that they were hard up, they couldn't meet their expenses, and that this terrible tax burden had to be taken away from them. Otherwise, there would be sort of financial catastrophe.
The subject of tax generates more criticism of the monarchy than anything else. Opinion polls show that 80% of people believe that as a matter of principle, the Queen should pay it. And yet she seems unwilling to do so. Perhaps this is because, like previous generations, the royal family still feels insecure about money.
For years, Prince Philip used to do the football coupons in the hope that he would win the jackpot. He used to go around telling people, at least I'll have some money. The Queen, on one occasion, was going to Windsor Castle. She passed by a greengrocer's shop in her Rolls Royce and saw the price of apples. She said to the chauffeur, "Tell chef to take them off the menu. They're far too expensive." I mean, they've got this very strange, ambivalent attitude to money. Of course, they don't carry it, so they don't really have much of an idea of what its value is or what its worth is.
But the monarch's tax status is turning into a political issue. Last year, the Liberal Democrat MP, Simon Hughes, introduced a bill to make the Queen pay tax on her personal fortune.
There was some support on the Tory side. There was much more support on the opposition benches. My plan now in the new Parliament, in a new session, is to introduce a similar bill again. And I hope that if I can manage to introduce it more early in a session, in this session, then it will get further. And we'll really be able to see how many people back it and how many people don't.
Next year alone, it's estimated that the Queen will save around £20 million in tax. When this is added to the civil list and the £46 million spent by government departments, it brings the total cost of the monarchy to nearly £80 million a year. To its supporters, this is entirely justifiable.
There are some arguments for a republic, and there are some arguments for a grand monarchy, but for a mean, parsimonious, cheese-paring, candle-end monarchy, there are no arguments whatsoever.
In fact, Britain spends at least 10 times as much on its monarchy as any other country in Europe. The Spanish royal family, for example, with whom Charles and Diana have spent holidays, is modest by comparison. King Juan Carlos has no private income and pays tax like his subjects. Each year, the government gives him a single allowance, which has to pay for the entire cost of royalty. Last year, this allowance was just £4.5 million. However, the British monarchy has a much higher international profile than its Spanish equivalent, and it's widely believed that it acts as a tourist attraction and revenue earner. Last year, 7.5 million foreigners came to Britain for a holiday, and they spent over £3 billion here.
The monarch is a tremendous asset to tourism, and there's no doubt about it that this glamour, this show business, the pageantry, the tradition is a huge draw. In fact, in the advertising we do in America, which is still our most important market, we call ourselves the world capital of pageantry. And, you know, nobody argues with that, because what we've got here with the royal family is unique. Other people may have minor royals and they may bicycle down the road, but we have the monarchy show. It's our sort of last stronghold of romantic extravagance, and I think more than worthwhile, worth the expenditure.
But it's difficult to gather concrete evidence to support this view. While it's certainly true that visitors flock to Buckingham Palace and the changing of the guard once they're here, there's nothing to indicate that the monarchy influences their decision to come to Britain in the first place. The London Tourist Board carries out periodic surveys to find out what attracts tourists to London. In 1975, just 1% mentioned royalty or the Queen. And when they repeated the question in 1990, no one mentioned it at all. And there are some who say that just as many tourists would come to Britain even if we didn't have a monarchy.
Certainly we get a lot of tourists, but we don't need a living monarchy to promote tourism. Other countries have tourists, for instance France, where they go to see the Palace of Versailles, and they haven't got living royalty. The attraction is history, and I think when tourists come here, they're interested in the long history that Britain has, and they would still come for that reason, even if we didn't have any living royalty.
But even if the royal family does attract foreign revenue, the public still expects to see them working hard. The Princess Royal carries out the greatest number of engagements, 688 last year. Prince Charles managed 460, and the Princess of Wales, 397. But several engagements can be carried out on one day, and when this is taken into account, the figures look less impressive. They show that Prince Charles had 18 weeks with no engagements last year. Prince Edward, 24. And Princess Margaret, 35 weeks. And so the grumbles about money and the monarchy continue. And even their supporters agree there's a lot they could do to allay the criticisms.
I think the criticism that's been levelled at the Queen about not paying tax on her private income actually is quite justified. I think it is extraordinary that this situation should have developed, and I think that it is wrong, and I think the Queen should be advised to voluntarily surrender some of her private income to the taxman.
Well, I don't think the time has come at this moment for a change, but I can clearly see the disadvantages that accrue to the Queen from criticism that she doesn't pay tax on her private income. And it may well be that in the medium term it will be seen that the disadvantages outweigh the advantages.
It's also suggested that there could be advantages in reducing the number of paid royals.
There's plenty they could do to stop the criticism of the monarchy, and I think the most immediate one they should do is to cut in half, really, the number of people who are on the civil list. I think those that shouldn't be on it include the Queen's sister, Princess Margaret. I don't think people want Prince Andrew on. He's got a naval career. And people certainly don't want Prince Edward on it. Taxpayers don't want to pay for people like the Duke and Duchess of York or Prince Edward. They don't want it. It irritates them, and they have got to be sensitive to this irritation.
But in the short term at least, changes in the financing of the monarchy appear unlikely.
I see no movement at all inside Buckingham Palace to change the way that things are done. Effectively, that means that the running saw about the Queen not paying tax, about their various fiscal privileges will continue. And that, I believe, is a kind of canker that eats at the very heart and the soul of the British monarchy and undermines its popularity and the respect for which people hold it.